Hello, everybody, and welcome to our ADEA AADSAS Fee Assistance Program webinar. My name is Andrew Whitson, and I'm supported here today by my colleagues, Dr. Emily Reinberger and Miss Jessica O'Keefe. And so looks like we've got a good mix of folks in our poll here from all over the United States and a couple folks from abroad. So welcome. We're happy you are here. And so we're going to start off with our agenda here. So the first thing we're going to discuss is what is ADEA AADSAS FAP. We're also going to cover the dates and deadlines that you should be keeping in mind as you're getting started with your dental school application. We'll discuss some eligibility requirements for the FAP program. We'll discuss and show some document examples. And then we'll also talk about maybe some extenuating circumstances or missing documentation scenarios that might come up. And then we'll finalize with, once you've received your FAP decision, what to do next. And we'll finish the day with questions and answers. So I've seen a couple questions come through already in the Q&A. That's great. If you do have questions that you want to bring up to us, make sure to put those in the Q&A. We'll keep the chat as just opportunities for you to chat amongst yourselves, but we'll be monitoring the Q&A a little bit more closely for specific FAP related questions. And my colleagues will answer some of those questions directly in the Q&A and flag those that we should cover at the end for the Q&A portion. So let's dive on in. So the ADEA AADSAS FAP program is a fee assistance program that is meant for applicants to dental school. As I'm sure all of you know, or will soon find out, dental school is a very expensive and potentially multi-year process. And so this program was designed to help reduce some of those financial barriers to help you apply to your different dental schools that you're looking to apply to. And so students who are approved for FAP do get 3 waive designations in ADEA AADSAS, which is a $494 value. And one other thing that's nice about the FAP program, many of the schools that we work with will also waive some of those secondary application fees for their programs if you show your FAP approval email. So it's not every school, but many of them do also waive those secondary fees to, again, reduce some of those financial barriers to applying. All right, so moving on to our dates and deadlines. So the FAP application is going to open on April 15th. And then about a month later, the ADEA AADSAS application will open. And then June 2nd is the big date for FAP and AADSAS. So on that date, FAP will close. So no more applications will be accepted after that date. And on that date, ADEA AADSAS will open for submissions. And one thing that is really important here is you want to make sure not to submit the ADEA AADSAS application until you have received notification from us about FAP. So many people may have to wait a day in order to submit that ADEA AADSAS application because FAP approval notifications are going to start on June 3rd. So we're going to start on a rolling basis by notifying those who have applied on June 3rd. So if you were an early applicant to FAP, you should get that notification on the 3rd. And if not, if you were a later applicant, those notifications are going to roll until the end of the month. So most should receive a notification by the end of June. And regardless of when you receive that notification, you'll get 30 days from that notification to utilize your funding in the ADEA AADSAS. So you'll have 30 days to use. Moving along to our eligibility requirements. So in order to be eligible for this program, your adjusted gross income, or AGI, needs to be at or below 300% of the 2025 U.S. poverty guidelines. And this information is in our Help Center. So I've pinned in the chat the Help Center link. So feel free to click on that and bookmark it. The eligibility section there is going to provide all of this great details about the AGI and how it applies to your unique situation. And one thing to keep in mind here is the household size. That is the first part of the eligibility requirement. That is anyone that lives in your house. So it could be roommates, it could be family. It is anyone that lives underneath your roof, regardless of if they are on your or your parents' taxes. And another thing to keep in mind here is the guidelines that we have listed are for the 48 contiguous United States. So if you happen to live in Hawaii or Alaska or any other US territory or internationally, you're still going to utilize these guidelines in order to determine your eligibility. The next thing you're going to need is a dent pin. So if you've already taken some of your testing, you should have this dent pin. And if not, you're going to want to click on, or you can find more information on the ADA website. And that is how you will obtain your dent pin. You also need to submit your US federal tax documents. And so every applicant needs to submit at least one Form 1040. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the scenarios of how that might apply to your unique situation. But just keep in mind that everyone needs to submit at least one of those US federal tax documents, the Form 1040. And then as we talked about earlier, that June 2nd to June 3rd timeline, you'll want to make sure to wait to submit your ADEA AADSAS designation until you've received your FAP notification. And the reason for that is if you submit your ADEA AADSAS before you've received that FAP notification, the FAP designations won't be in your account to utilize. And so then you won't be able to get that funding if you've already applied to ADEA AADSAS. And we won't be able to refund any potential designations you've already paid for. So I'm going to pause here for a second. And I'm going to post our second poll. And so this poll is going to ask you if this is your first time applying to ADEA AADSAS FAP. So just let us know if this is your first time this year, or maybe you've applied in years past. All right, looks like most people, this is your first year, so welcome. And a handful of folks, you are returning to us and you've applied in the past. Welcome as well. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so moving on into our documentation. So we talked a little bit about the Form 1040. So again, you are going to need a 2025 Form 1040 for yourself. And if you did not earn enough income to file a US tax document, the Form 1040, then you don't necessarily need to provide that information since you didn't apply. You would need to supply that information for your parent or guardians. Now, let's say if you didn't give us a Form 1040, but you did earn some income and you have a W-2, you'll want to include that in your application, and then also include some rationale in your application about, that you did not earn enough income to file taxes for 2025. Same thing if you happen to be a contractor and you have a 1099 form, you'd want to include that. But for people who filed taxes, you're going to want to include that Form 1040 and then any relevant W-2 or 1099 forms. And then if your parents claim you as a dependent on their taxes, you're going to want to provide their Form 1040s and then any associated W-2s and or 1099s. And if you are married, you're going to want to include your spouse's Form 1040, or if you file jointly, it'll just be yours together with theirs and any of their associated W-2s and 1099s. Now you're probably thinking, this is kind of complicated already, right? And it definitely is. So everyone's tax situation is a little bit different. So if you ever have questions about what you should or shouldn't apply or add to your application, you can always reach out to us here at ADEA at the email that I've put and pinned in the chat. Or you can always check out the Help Center as well on the eligibility guidelines to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And so you might be thinking, what do these forms look like? So before we go to the financial aid documentation, let's take a look at what the tax documentations look like. So that US Form 1040, it's going to look like this. And you're going to make sure it has 2025 up at the top there where it's circled in blue. And then, so kind of going back to those W-2s and 1099s, all those numbers that I'm throwing out at you, if there is a number amount listed in number 1A here, where it says Forms W-2 in box 1, if there's a number in that box, you're most likely going to want to include a W-2 in your application, and they should match up. And then if you've got a number in line 1H, that is most likely where your income for being self-employed, that information is going to live there. And so you should have a Form 1099 or some kind of rationale in the application pointing to whatever information in your 1040 tax return includes that self-employed income. And let's go ahead and take a look at what those two documents look like. So a W-2, yours probably isn't going to be red. These are red because they are blank. Yours should probably be black or gray, but that W-2 should still be on there somewhere, as well as the correct year. Both of those are circled in blue. And then for the 1099, most of the self-employed income that we're seeing these days comes in a 1099 NEC, but yours might look different from this, and that is okay. Your 1099 may or may not need it to be included with your FAP application, depending on what it is. If it's an NEC, it definitely should be included. And if you have questions about the other ones, make sure to refer to the Help Center or reach out to us. And when in doubt, include the documentation that you have in your FAP application. So let's go back to our required documentation here and jump to financial aid. So for financial aid, we've made a little bit of a change here because there was some confusion in years past about what was required. And so for this year, we are going to require the FAFSA submission summary. And so that is going to replace what we asked for in the past, which was a school award letter. And this will look like this. So it should say right at the top, FAFSA, and it'll say FAFSA submission summary. It's directly from the government when you apply for your financial aid each year. And in addition to it saying the FAFSA submission summary, it should have an amount listed for your expected federal Pell Grant amount, which is that you'll see here with the blue arrow, as well as your student aid index, which will be down towards the bottom. And I've got highlighted there with that blue arrow as well. To go back to our required documentation here, some other potential documentation that might be required is for any other kind of income that you might be receiving on a monthly or annual basis. Things like Social Security, SNAP benefits, AFDC, veterans benefits, housing subsidies, child support, alimony, etc. So again, you'll want to include those in your application for FAP. And one thing to keep in mind here is all of the documentation that you need to include should be combined into one PDF for submission. And so to do that, there are a couple of different ways. You can utilize a site I like to use called iHeart PDF, or any other PDF combination software that you might find helpful, because it's going to be a long document. We typically see a lot of 50+ page documents, and that's okay. If yours is less than that, that's also okay, because remember, everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different. All right. So moving on to some extenuating circumstances or missing documentation. So let's say, your situation doesn't fit into one of these scenarios. You always want to include some kind of rationale in your application. And that's going to be helpful to us when we're evaluating your application. So it may help you, and it will be considered when we are evaluating your application, but it may not always replace those missing documents. So when you can, you want to make sure to include the documentation. But if for some reason you're just unable to do so, make sure to put some rationale in the application so that we know it's not just missing. So a couple of examples of frequent circumstances. Let's say your AGI, or the adjusted gross income, exceeds the limit, but there's some kind of financial hardship that you've got going on. Typically, if someone's within a couple of $1,000s of that guideline, that we encourage you to apply and include some rationale in your application. And if it's significantly over that amount, but there's some kind of financial hardship situation, again, we encourage you to apply, but make sure to put some rationale in the application of what was going on in 2025 that made it so that you had financial hardship even with a high AGI or above that 300% guideline. Some other things that might be helpful to put in your application is if there are any hardships that may or may not have documentation. So things like job loss or medical expenses or any family hardship. If you put some rationale in the application, that is always helpful for us to see the full picture of what's going on beyond just the numbers on a page. And then some missing documentation examples. So we talked about this briefly earlier where, maybe you didn't earn enough income in 2025 to file taxes. You'll want to make sure to include that in your rationale of your application. And if you have any W-2s or 1099s, you'll want to make sure to include those as well so that we can consider that. This one's common. Tax day is coming up on April 15th. It's the same day FAP opens. And if you had to file for a tax extension, or if your parents or spouses had to file for a tax extension, you'll want to include some rationale in the application, and then also include the approved extended document from the government, which is the Form 4868. Or let's say your W-2 information is included in your 1040 form. So a lot of the tax companies will do that. They'll include the W-2 information. It's really helpful if you put a page number on your application to let us know where that information is, so we just don't miss it, and it doesn't rule you out from consideration for FAP. And then the last thing here, or two more, if you were unable to connect with your parent or guardian to get that tax documentation, but you are listed as a dependent, again, we will take rationale into consideration. And if you put that into your missing documentation section, we'll review it and make a decision based off of the information we do have. And then this last one, if you did not attend school in 2025 to 2026, there is a question on the application that will ask you if you were a student in school or not. But just to make sure, we're not looking for a document that's missing, put in the rationale section of the application that you didn't attend school as well, just so that we've got that confirmed and we're not looking for something that is there or not. All right. So moving on to once you've received your FAP decision, what's next? So if you were approved, congratulations. Log into ADEA AADSAS, and you're going to complete 3 school designations and their school-specific materials. And you're going to submit all 3 of those schools simultaneously within 30 days of receiving your FAP notification. And so this highlighted bullet here, if you submit individually, it will only allow you to apply to that one school with the FAP funding as opposed to 3. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that here in a second. So this is what the screen is going to look like when you're adding designations to your ADEA AADSAS application. And so you'll see here with those big red X's, you do not want to submit a program individually if you've been approved for FAP. If you see down here at the bottom where there's that green circle and arrow, you're going to want to submit all 3 applications together. And so to go back here for a second, if you want to apply to more than 3 schools, you absolutely are able to do so. Those are just going to be at your individual applicant's expense. And those are $115 for each designation after that first one. And on the flip side, if you happen to be denied for FAP, you're going to go ahead and log into the ADEA AADSAS application and submit your designations at the standard rates. So again, that's $264 for the first designation, and then $115 for each one following that. And just keep in mind that the ADEA AADSAS application cycle closes on February 5th of next year. Crazy to say 2027 already. One thing to keep in mind here is FAP decisions are final. So if you receive a notice that you were not approved for FAP and you submit additional documentation, we are not going to be able to re-review that for corrections. Unless there happens to be some kind of glitch or your document, there's a blank page or something like that. If that occurs on a case-by-case basis, we may re-review. Again, just a reminder, submit all 3 at the same time. We don't have any way to re-administer those funds once you have submitted. All right, let's jump into some scenarios here. So the first scenario is for Dylan, and Dylan graduates in May of this year. Dylan's not married, works a part-time job off campus in 2025, and parents both worked full-time W-2 jobs in 2025, and they filed their taxes jointly and claimed Dylan as a dependent. So one follow-up question that I would have here for Dylan is that part-time job. Do you remember what I was saying about if they have enough income to file taxes or not? When I see part-time job, most likely a student that's working a part-time job may not have made enough to file for taxes in 2025. So that would be my follow-up question for this scenario. But let's take a look at what documents are required for Dylan. So that first follow-up question aligns with this first highlighted item. So depending on how much Dylan earned in 2025, they may or may not need to include a Form 1040, but they should include a W-2 since they worked in 2025. And then because their parents claim them as a dependent, their parent or guardian Form 1040s will be required, as well as their associated W-2s. And then the last required documentation here is the FAFSA submission summary, since Dylan went to school in 2025 to 2026. Hopefully that's making sense, but we're going to do another scenario. So Blair graduated in 2022, is married, and they filed their taxes separately, works a full-time job, a W-2 job in 2025. Their spouse is a 1099 contractor. this one's complicated. Their parents did not claim Blair as a dependent, and they are a SNAP benefit recipient. So let's take a look at what documents are required. So because Blair worked in 2025 and earned enough income to file taxes, we are going to need a 2025 Form 1040 for Blair, as well as that associated W-2. We're also going to need a Form 1040 for their spouse and that 1099 because they were a contractor. The other thing that we need is SNAP documentation. But if you see my little note here, what else should Blair add to the application? Go ahead and type in the chat what else you think Blair needs to add in. Oh, actually, I lied. I made a poll for this. So I am going to share that poll. Hold on one second. So go ahead and answer the poll of what Blair should add to their application. All right, let's see. Looks like some are coming in. Excellent. So it looks like 38 of you have got it correct. So gold star for you. If you put rationale, not a student in 2025 to 2026, you are on the right page. So great job. I'm going to share my screen again. Perfect. One other thing to keep in mind here with Blair's situation, so anytime a 1099 is involved, sometimes that the amount of income on a 1099 might be really high, but the impact on your AGI, that adjusted gross income, might be different for this because it's a business. So if you have high income, but you had high business expenses, you'll want to make sure to note that in your rationale of your application. It happens, a fair amount. So just make sure to denote that so that we're not seeing some adjusted, inflated 1099s, but we may not necessarily see that business expense. So just make sure to let us know that information so that we're not factoring in something incorrectly. All right, so closing up here, ADEA AADSAS FAP opens on April 15th, and it's going to close on June 2nd. And we're going to be sending out notifications on a rolling basis beginning June 3rd and should finish by the end of June. And you'll have 30 days to utilize funding from the date of your notification. And you do need to submit all your documentation and rationale in your application at the time that you are applying. You can save and go back. So let's say you're kind of getting towards the end of your application and realize you forgot a document. You can save it and come back. You'll just need to make sure all of those documents are together in one PDF before you submit. And then if you have any questions as you're going through this, you can reach out to us at fapadsas@adea.org. And also I highly recommend that you check out our help center, which should be linked in the chat. And then our next webinar is going to be the ADEA AADSAS webinar. So if you have additional questions about the process for applying to dental school, that's a great place to check that out and hear more from my colleague, Shante. And that's going to be on April 21st at 3:30. All right, so I am going to stop sharing. And we're going to jump into some questions here. All right, let's see here. So the first one I see here from Tammy, how long should each rationale be? So that's a great question, and my answer is going to be it depends, right? So if your situation has a lot of unique components, then your rationale might be a lot longer than somebody else's that fits really neatly into those those categories for taxes. But if, let's say, you've got had a difficult 2025 and weren't able to get in touch with your parents for tax documentation, your rationale should probably be a little bit longer to support your application. Next one here that I'm seeing is, does the 1098-T need to be included for FAP? It's a great question. So the 1098-T does not show all the information that we need to see for FAP. So the best documentation is going to be directly from FAFSA, the FAFSA submission summary. All right, let's see what else we've got here. So I see one here, the DAT is April 15th. So I just want to make sure I would still be able to apply for FAP. Yes, you should definitely start your application for FAP. Your DAT is going to be important for the ADEA AADSAS application, but we don't need the DAT score for your FAP. So that is totally fine. Let's see what else we've got here. Okay, so Jenna had a question here about the application. So yes, there is a section that will ask for any rationale about your scenario in 2025. So that's a great place to attach that information. There's also a missing documentation section in the application. So if you have any documents that are missing, you'll want to note that there. So there's 2 long answer components in the FAP application. Those are the places where you'd have a little bit more space to include some rationale. Good question here from Hossein. So if there's no FAFSA for me and you didn't have to utilize FAFSA, you will need to include some information from your school that denotes that you did not receive financial aid. So if you did not receive financial aid, your school needs to provide that information that you were a self-pay student or out-of-pocket pay student. There's a question here from Yvonne. If I have my own taxes and my parents do too, do our incomes combined count as the total for the poverty guidelines? So answer depends on whether or not they claim you as a dependent. So if they claim you as a dependent, then your AGI and their AGI would be combined for your total AGI. But if they do not claim you as a dependent and you are independent, it would just be your AGI. It's a great question. So kind of along the same lines here, this question from Olivia. If I don't qualify for being a dependent and file taxes this year for myself, but live with my family, would I submit only my taxes or my and my parents' taxes? So this one, it's a great question. Even if you live with your parents, but you are not claimed as a dependent, so if you are an independent, but you still live with your parents, you would just submit your taxes. But the nice thing is that those parents will count towards your household number when you're calculating your AGI. So that's a unique scenario, but would actually help you in this case, it sounds like, Olivia. So if it's just you and your parents there, your household size would be 3, but you would just be putting your income on the slot for the AGI. So Lauren, I attended a 1-year master's program from January 2025 to December 2025. Would this count as the 2024-25 or 25-26 year? I believe that that would count for 25-26, Lauren, especially if you applied for the 25-26 FAFSA. So I would say go ahead and include the FAFSA information that you have there. Grad programs are a little bit different. So also include that it was a graduate program that you attended in 25-26. They're funded a little bit differently from the government. So this one, I think we've already addressed it about parents versus household size and independent dependent status for Arsalan. So I think we're all set there. We talked about 1098T forms. Thank you to Jessica and Emily. Looks like a lot of these questions have been answered as we were going. So, Alondria, will the FAFSA submission summary be necessary if you are a traditional student that is no longer a university student? So if you were not a student in 25-26, then we do not need that FAFSA submission summary. If you're a non-traditional student and you're applying to school afterwards and maybe aren't utilizing FAFSA, then you would just need a letter from your school that tells us that you did not receive financial aid for the 25-26 school year. I'm not sure I'm answering that question, so if you need clarification, Alondria, let us know in the Q&A. So if my student is an international student and I don't have him on my taxes, can I still include in my taxes? So this one is a little bit complicated. So if they're an international student, but you are here locally and filing taxes, then we will need that information from you as that Form 1040 for the parent or guardian that is claiming that international student as a dependent. I think that is what you are asking, but if not, please let me know in the Q&A. So JC, what can I do, again, if I'm below the tax filing bracket? You're going to want to include a W-2 if you have it, and you also want to include rationale in the application that says you do not have a 1040 because you did not make enough in 2025 to file. So Yvonne, to be clear, if my parents file me as a dependent and I also file my own, am I submitting both those tax forms? The answer is yes to that. So if they claim you as a dependent and you also earned income and had to file taxes, we would need both of those to be included in the calculation of your adjusted gross income, or AGI. And same thing, so Paula, if your parents didn't earn enough to file taxes for 2025, but you did, then you would just need to include your Form 1040. And then if they claim you as a dependent but didn't file taxes, then you just want to include rationale that your parents didn't earn enough income in 2025 to file taxes. Well, this is a good question from Daniel. What if I plan to take my DAT sometime mid-July? Will my FAP approval expire by the time I submit applications, and then will I have to reapply? So there is no reapply for FAP. You have to utilize it within those 30 days. So what we recommend you do here is you're going to want to apply to those 3 schools in ADEA AADSAS to utilize your FAP funding before your application deadline, so that 30 days. And now what you will do is you can submit your application without all of your test scores and without all of your letters of evaluation, things like that. Those can come later. So you'll just apply with the information that you have now. And you should be able to submit your ADEA AADSAS without the DAT score, just that you've scheduled to take it later on, and then it will update once you have taken it later on. It's a great question. But unfortunately, the 30 days is a hard deadline. So if you don't utilize your funding, you would lose it. I'm just scrolling through here to see. Okay, so Alondria question here. If you live with someone, but they do not file you under their taxes and vice versa, how would the situation apply under the AGI? So this, I think we covered it, but just to reiterate, if someone lives with you, roommates, etc., that still counts towards your household size. So you would utilize that number. So let's say you live with 4 people in your house and yourself, so that's 5. You would utilize that 5 people as your household size, regardless of the tax situation. There's a question here of what time on April 15th will the application be opened? It should be open at 12:01, so first thing in the morning. So it should be there when you are ready to apply. If not, let us know. Let's see here. All right, I'm going back to the top. Lots of great questions, folks. So let's see here. If my AGI is within the limit, can I submit my application if I filed by myself in 2025 but was previously claimed in 2024? Yes, we will only be looking at 2025. So if you are independent as of 2025, then that is how you are going to apply for FAP. We do not need the information from 2024. All right, JC question here. If I graduated in May 2025 and used FAFSA during my education, can I include that in my application form for the rationale? Yes, you'll want to put that in the rationale that you graduated in 2025, so you don't have a 25-26 FAFSA. This is a good question just to flag for folks from Angelita. Do my chances of receiving the FAP lower the later I apply to it? Yes. So it is first come, first serve. So if you wait until the last minute to apply, it's certainly not guaranteed that you will get something. We typically do administer all of the funds that we have. And so unfortunately, there are some folks that don't get FAP if they apply late. This is a good question from Nicholas. If I did not attend university in 25-26, do I still need a letter from my university that explains that I wasn't a student, or is the rationale enough? We do not require a letter if you didn't attend school. So rationale is enough for the FAP application. The letter comes into play as if you were a student in 25-26 but didn't receive financial aid. So that distinction there. Letters of if you were a current student but didn't receive financial aid. Rationale is if you were not a student in 25-26. Okay, so a question here from Mona. If I pay for some applications by May 12th while I wait for the status and hope to apply for more, and I were to get accepted for FAP, can I still use those 3 applications for additional schools? So some clarification here, you won't be able to submit schools in ADEA AADSAS until June 2nd. And if you apply for any schools on June 2nd or until you receive your FAP notification, you would no longer be able to utilize funding for FAP if approved. So you'll want to wait to receive your FAP notification before submitting any applications in ADEA AADSAS. All right. If I am still living with my parents and they receive SNAP benefits, do I provide the documentation for that in my application? So this is a good question from Daphne. I would say yes, include that, especially if you are claimed as a dependent on their taxes. If you are not claimed as a dependent, then you wouldn't necessarily need to include the SNAP benefit information. So really where we want the parent information is if you are claimed as a dependent. Okay, looks like clarification here from Lara. If the child is U.S. citizen but parents are not and thus do not file taxes in the U.S., they do not have 1040 W-2 or 1099 form. In that case, would the only consideration be the child's W-2, 1099, and 1040 form? Yes. So the caveat here is that if the child is earning income but maybe didn't receive enough to claim a 1040, we would need that W-2 1099 information. And if there's no 1040 for this case, we're going to need some rationale on the application explaining the scenario, because a 1040 form is required in order to qualify for FAP. We need some kind of tax documentation for every applicant. It looks like we've covered most. Just making sure we haven't missed anything here. Okay, so from Selena, if I filed a 2025-26 FAFSA and attended school in 25-26, but only received financial aid for fall 25, but not for spring, would the FAFSA summary still be enough, or do I need a letter from school explaining why I didn't get financial aid for spring? Yes, your FAFSA submission summary would suffice. We don't need a letter explaining that you didn't get financial aid in the spring. Angelita's question, if they don't claim me as a dependent, I don't have to put their tax forms? Yes, that is correct. Question from Tammy here. I applied to FAFSA to see if my CC would be covered, but I did not receive the Pell Grant. However, in the previous years in undergrad at a university, I received the Pell Grant. So should I include my university award letter? This is a good question, Tammy. It's a little bit of a unique scenario. What I would recommend is including your FAFSA submission summary, and then there's a question in the application that asks if you've received a federal Pell Grant. Make sure to indicate yes on that. And then in your rationale, you can either include this information or if you are able to obtain screenshots from your account summary of those Pell Grants or some information about the Pell Grants that you received, that would be helpful for your application. I think we covered that one, Mona. So a question here, if I received state aid but no FAFSA, so most likely you would have had to apply for financial aid to receive it. If your state is unique in that, then definitely make sure to put in the rationale that information. That would be pretty rare, but if that is the case, just make sure you include whatever information you can from your state or your school. And in the rationale, include that you didn't put the FAFSA submission summary and the reason why. So question here from Vanessa, if you were in a master's program and on scholarship, should I include a letter from them? If you have a letter that you can include, that would be great. It could be the scholarship award letter. That would be helpful to include if you didn't apply for FAFSA for your master's program in 25-26. If it was a previous year, we wouldn't necessarily need that information. So a question here from Mason. Is there an essay portion to demonstrate need aside from the rationale, or is it just documentation? So there is a long response question where you can include rationale. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal essay, but it can be a long response indicating any particular scenario or situation that occurred in 2025 that you'd like to bring to our attention. Okay, a question here about repeating what to provide in terms of documentation if your parents don't earn enough to file taxes. So for this situation, Paula, if you are earning enough income to file taxes, then we would need your Form 1040 and any associated W-2s or 1099s. And if your parents didn't earn enough, we would want some rationale about that if they're claiming you as a dependent, but not filing taxes. If you're independent, then we don't need that information from them. All right. Vicki, I think we've covered this, but just to reiterate, if you have testing that you are completing that's post July, in terms of receiving those scores, we still do recommend that you apply within the 30-day window so that you are able to utilize your funding. Because if you wait until after that 30 days, you will lose that FAP. And just a reminder, you should be able to submit and then include those scores later on for anything that you have taken post-submission. I think we've covered this one, Olivia, in terms of dependent and household size. Okay, looks like we've covered pretty much everything. I'm going to go back up to the top here and see if there's any new questions that have come in that haven't been answered. So a question here from Yvonne. Should I include that when I was in school back in 2025 that I got FAFSA and received the Pell Grant? Yes. So in the application, it's going to ask you if you received a Pell Grant. You're going to want to say yes to that question. And it will ask you if you were a student in 25-26, and you're going to say no. Lauren, question here that you applied for FAFSA and you received a grant from your master's, but there's nothing in writing. So I would include your FAFSA submission summary and then put in the rationale the grant that you received and that you don't have any written documentation of it. The question here about I took classes in 2025 post bachelor's. and didn't qualify for FAFSA since I wasn't an undergrad, that's fine. Yep, you're still going to want to put that you were a student in 2025 to 2026 and put that you were in a post-bachelor program and didn't qualify for FAFSA. Just a confirmation here for Joanna. If you are under 26 but not claimed as a dependent, is it okay to include your to not include your parents' tax documents even if you live with them? Yes. So if you are a dependent, all we need is your tax information, and they will still be included in your household size. So if it's just you and the two of them, the household size would be 3, but we just need the AGI for you and tax documents. Okay, this is kind of a good closing question here from Janaea. Hello, I graduated with my bachelor's degree in August 2025. Also, I start my master's in August 2026 and applied for FAFSA for my master's. I won't receive any grants for my master's since I used it in undergrad. I am also a dependent on my parent tax form. What form should I submit in my situation? So since you have applied for FAFSA, we're going to want your FAFSA submission summary, even if you aren't receiving grants. And you should answer that you have received a Pell Grant in the past. And you are going to want to include your tax form information. And since you are a dependent on your parents, we also need your parent tax information. All right, since we are coming up of the top of the hour here, there have been lots of great questions. Hopefully this has helped clarify some things for all of you. If you have remaining questions, make sure to check out our help center, which is pinned at the top of the chat. And if you have additional questions beyond that, feel free to reach out to us at the FAP email, and we'd be happy to help clarify things. It's been a pleasure to speak with you here today. Again, I hope this was helpful, and we look forward to seeing your applications for FAP and for ADEA AADSAS. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.